Hello folks, and welcome to the very first episode of the newest show on the Destination Linux network, GameSphere, with your host, chriswere. That's me. So I'm going to do a little introductory segment here which sort of demonstrates what this show is going to be about, and then we'll get into it. So fundamentally, this is going to be a show about video games. Now, I play video games on Linux distributions. Which one, you may ask? Well, quite a few. I bounce around from distribution to distribution. I've got Linux Mint on this machine here. I've got Debian on this machine right to my just out of shot here. On that laptop behind me, I can't even remember. I think it might be Debian, but I'm going to put something else on it now. But yeah, so what type of games are we going to be talking about? Well, I will be playing all of my games on Linux. There may be a few games here and there that I may come across on a console or something that I feel may be worthy of discussion. But for the most part, it's going to be PC gaming and probably not so much in the way of AAA gaming. I'm going to be covering a lot of indie games. I'm certainly going to be covering some open source games. I feel that there are a great deal of open source gems out there that many people have not yet heard of. And then there will be, of course, some games that are a little bit more well known that I will enjoy playing. Also, I'll be talking a lot about industry news and also how the industry technology develops. I'm a big fan of cloud gaming, things like Stadia and GeForce Now, both platforms that work remarkably well on Linux, but also on other systems as well. And I know that, of course, these platforms have not been universally accepted or sort of appreciated. Which is fine, but we can talk about that in more depth as the podcast goes on, because I know, of course, there are always questions about things like game ownership. So we'll probably be talking a fair amount about DRM, physical media, digital media, what this means, and all of the sort of the deeper stuff inside that. So yeah, there's a lot to talk about. But yeah, so without further ado, let's crack on with the show. I've got my show notes right here. But actually, I'll tell you what, now is a very exciting time for the very first ad read on this show. So, all kind of terrible things can happen when you don't take care of your digital security, and that, of course, includes your passwords. The passwords used and trusted by the Destination Linux network is Bitwarden. Bitwarden lets you set up things like a PIN to easily access your password manager, as well as additional authentications such as master passwords and adding passphrases to fingerprint security, all to keep your passwords safe. Bitwarden is the easiest and safest way for individuals, teams and businesses to store, share and sync sensitive data. Go to bitwarden.com/DLN to get started for free. To make things even better, Bitwarden is 100% open source. You can self-host it, and they do security audits, which is all pretty neat. So bitwarden.com/DLN, that's DLN, of course, for the Destination Linux Network, DLN. Get started for free. For the $10 a year premium, that gets you 1 gigabyte of encrypted file storage, 2-step login with the YubiKey, U2F and Duo, Vault Health reports, time-based one-time password authentication storage and generation, and priority customer support. So thank you very much, Bitwarden. You're very kind for supporting this episode of GameSphere and basically for all around being a good egg to the Linux community. Thank you very much, Bitwarden. You help get this show on the road. So there we go. First ad read. But yeah, Bitwarden, thank you very much for making all this possible. That's really quite nice. So anyway, what is the first item on the docket for today? Okay. All right. Here's one that I'm sure, let's start off with a bang. This is not the newest news in the world, but Stadia director says streamers should pay game developers royalties. So I'm sure many of you folks, this is not new news. I'm sure many of you folks have heard this before. But Alex Hutchinson, okay, so I'm reading from here a metro.co.uk, which is a newspaper here in the UK, an article that covered it. And they're referring to this chap as a creative director at Google, but I think since this article has been written, it turns out he sort of embellished a little bit his role at Google, and he's actually rather sort of a member of one of the first-party development studios that Google Stadia has on their, in their ownership, I believe. So anyway, he fundamentally is making the argument Actually, he says so in a tweet here, so I'll just read out the tweet verbatim. The truth is that streamers should be paying the developers and publishers of the games they stream. They should be buying a license like any real business and paying for the content they use. If they think they don't need to pay for the game they are using, then they can make a show without games and see how that goes. So, this, of course, is a comment that has not been particularly well received by the gaming community. And it is kind of interesting. So, as we all know, there are many games that kind of became big as a result of streaming. The latest one at time of recording is Among Us, a game that actually came out in 2018, and it was around for quite some time. In fact, I believe they were even planning a sequel, and then suddenly streamers started streaming it, and it had this massive resurgence in popularity. And as a result, as a result of streamers, as a result of the publicity it got from basically word of mouth, it completely rejuvenated the game, and it made the developers, I assume, a lot of money. Now, the game itself is free on Android, but I think there are adverts. I, of course, play it on PC. It costs very little. It's like it's less than $5, I believe. And it's actually a really good game. In fact, as a bit of a side note, we played this on the latest Destination Linux Network Game Fest, which was here in November, and it was amazing. It was absolutely fantastic. What I'll do is I'll put a link in the show notes to the live stream, which was on the Destination Linux YouTube channel of the event, because it was amazing. And if you wish to participate in the next Destination Linux Game Fest, you need to become a Patreon for the Destination Linux Network. I think you get to decide, you get to vote on or discuss which games are going to be played at the next Game Fest, and then there are certain games within the Games Fest that only Patreons are able to play. I think in the last Game Fest, the one that I'm talking about now, non-patrons were invited to play Xenotic and Super Tuxcot, two amazing games, and then I think we played Among Us and something else. That just shows how bad my memory is. It had tanks in it, and they were games for patrons. So if you want to check that out, go to the Destination Linux Patreon, and I will, of course, link to that in the show notes that accompany this podcast. But back on track. But yeah, like Among Us, it's just an example of a game that basically made it became big with streaming. But here's the kicker, right? This is a precedent, I believe, in some ways that sort of needs to be set and solidified. Like at the moment, it's only sort of acceptable as a norm because it typically benefits everyone involved for the most part. But just because it's mutually beneficial doesn't necessarily off the bat make it either legal or right, because there are, depending on the game, there are many games where streaming can sort of replace sales, where it can be in essence a form of kind of piracy, right? So, if you're like running a pub or a restaurant or something, and you want to play football games, soccer games on the on the screens in the pub, you typically have to pay a license fee because it is sort of understood that you're showing the game, that's bringing people in through the door. They'll buy, the drinks and whatever in the pub, and yada yada. Everyone makes a buck, right? Wonderful. But in the case of streaming, it's almost in some ways like a little different, because streaming might bring people to a Twitch stream. The Twitch stream then might have a link to the game, or it might encourage people to then buy the game as a result, because it's kind of acting like free advertising. But then there are games like maybe your old Telltale games or certain games that are incredibly plot-centric, which watching a live stream, watching a YouTube Let's Play can fundamentally take the role of the game. Like you might not necessarily then buy a game if you've just seen all of the spoilers, all of the plot points in a video. So, like I say, this is something that doesn't necessarily have, to me, a clear answer. So I suppose, at this point, we're sort of treading new ground to work out where the boundaries are, who gets hurt, who gets the benefit from it. and sort of precedents I think are being set, because whereas we can make a video game and streaming comparable to public display of a film or of a sports event or something like that, it's also fair to sort of argue the counter that they're not the same. Some games, like for example Among Us, that's a game that, like, if you're watching a stream of it, is going, like, the transformative properties of that stream are going to depend almost entirely on the people playing it and how it's played and how it's presented. Whereas, for example, a Telltale game or a game that is incredibly narrative focused is going to be that has less of an the transformative properties of that in a Twitch stream are going to be substantially less. So I suppose what would make this kind of simpler is if the whether or not a developer or studio is happy for their game to be streamed on Twitch would be mentioned or would be made clear on purchase of the game, perhaps, and whether or not when you buy a game, right, you don't fundamentally buy a game to own it. You buy the rights to play the game along with the binary files for that game. So as part of that license, as part of those rights that you buy, you may or may not include the right to stream. I know that when I've been given review copies of in indie games before, they do actually often explicitly say, you can stream this, you can do this with it, you can do that with it. And in fact, there are indie games that I believe do make that clear in one way or another, that, yeah, please do stream this game. It does help us as a studio. And if you're a small indie studio, you're definitely going to get a benefit of streaming, whereas maybe for a big like, a Marvel type enterprise, if you're the next Marvel game, you're playing as the Hulk or Captain America or some big franchise like that, or a Disney game or a Star Wars game, a Nintendo game, where you've got big marketing firms behind it, maybe streaming might help less with that. I don't know. Maybe the ramifications are different. Are the ramifications different if you're streaming to like 1,000 people versus streaming to a couple of mates, like 4 or 5 people? So I guess these things are sort of being tread, but I don't kind of necessarily take the sort of the whole Twitter dunking on crowd approach of just like, oh, he's talking nonsense, oh, he's like, because there is something to be said, and it doesn't always, and it isn't always beneficial. In fact, here's another example. It's a bit of an edge case, a bit of a niche case. But my friend Steve, he made a game, just a little indie game. He was giving it away for free, a little indie game, and then PewDiePie picked it up, and PewDiePie gave his game a whole bunch of this like free publicity. But all it actually did for Steve's game is overrun his server, because there were like millions of people just flocking out, downloading Steve's game. Steve didn't make a penny. He had to pay quite a lot of money to keep his servers up and running, because all these people came and started downloading Steve's game. And poor old Steve, like, he didn't make a penny off it because he was giving away his game for free. So also, of course, conversely, it might also be worth like mentioning that, like, when it comes to intellectual property and rights and all this kind of stuff, like, maybe like someone shouldn't have advertising foisted upon them. Maybe having your game plastered everywhere is something that you don't necessarily want. Now, I don't know. That's just it was an interesting case, but it was one of those cases where it's like, yeah, like streaming someone else's game is kind of, I don't know, interesting effect, So I guess we'll find out in due course. I guess we'll work out precedents and all that kind of thing. But, well, such is life, isn't it? Okay, so I'm going to check my notes now and see what else I've got going on. Okay, here's an interesting bit of news. Do you guys remember Driver? Very, very old game. It kind of was like Grand Theft Auto, the earlier, so like, remember Grand Theft Auto 3, and that era of games where you were getting these open world 3D driving games. Yeah, Driver was one of those. Driver 2 has a new reverse engineered open source game engine. So I read this on gamingonlinux.com, wonderful website. But yeah, there is in development a engine rewrite for Driver 2, MIT licensed, and using a little bit of reverse engineering, similar to what you might expect out of OpenMW. That's the open source rewrite written engine for Morrowind. The open source rewritten OpenRA, which is the open source rewritten engine for Red Alert, and OpenXCOM. But yes, you do need to have the original game files in order to run it. But yeah, their current goals, it says here, their current goals include to make the game playable from start to finish with all the modes working as intended. Eventually, they want to rewrite it all to properly upgrade it with modern stuff. You can get it running on Linux, and the lead developer has a GitHub issue open indicating that they're looking for help sorting out automatic Linux and Mac OS builds. So that is pretty good. And actually, I'm going to link that in with a second piece of interesting news, because OpenMW, the open source rewritten engine for Morrowind, one of my favorite games of all time. Also, thanks to this engine, there was a fork of it, and they actually developed multiplayer for Morrowind. Actually developed multiplayer for open source Morrowind. That's pretty amazing. Pretty dang amazing. But yeah, and it allows you to play Morrowind, of course, with Driver 2, but it allows you to play Morrowind not only natively on Linux, and of course you do need the original game files for that, but it actually improves the game a lot. It's designed so that it is mod compatible, so you can drop in your favorite mods, and they should, in theory, work on OpenMW. I've not had an issue with it, but they also add in things like distant landscapes, so that you don't have, so it expands the view distance out to see the world. That's amazing, right? Because in Morrowind, right, for those of you that don't know, and I do recommend you go out and play that game. It goes on sale regularly. It's really not that expensive. It's available on all platforms. And I do recommend using the OpenMW engine as well, right? But the beauty of Morrowind as a story is that the main plot line takes place in the sort of metaphorical but also literal shadow of this volcano. And because the view distance is so short on the native game, you never really see that volcano until you approach it for the first time. And because the view distance is so shallow, you can't take in the sort of the grandiosity of it all. You can tell what they were going for when they by the layout of the land and when they were designing it, and it was technical limitations at the time that prevented them from truly recognizing this sort of like this metaphor in the level design itself. But being able to see and play the entire game under the shadow of this amazingly large mountain, always being there, always watching, it just adds this dimension of the game that is just amazing. Like, I can't even describe it. And it also adds all kinds of improvements as well. Takes out a lot of bugs. But this new one is that they're bringing in third-person view improvements. And I'm looking at a little animated GIF here, and I'm thinking this is just fantastic, because the third-person view in not only Morrowind but also Oblivion as well, another one of my favorite games, works amazingly through Steam's Proton and also through Wine. If you just want to download that on GOG, run it through Wine, works perfectly fine there as well. But yeah, so this one, yeah, the third person view is seeing a lot of improvements with the overshoulder of the camera, and being able to like better strafing animations, which is pretty amazing as well. So what else have we got here? Now there's some shader fixes as well, working on grass handling more by making it supported for animated grass. So that's pretty cool, making the world feel a little bit more alive there. There are performance when it comes to the sound, which is quite interesting. So a lot of these things here are largely like sort of just making a finer grained user experience, just making it just a nicer game to play in a lot of the smaller ways, because to be honest, a lot of the heavy lifting of the game itself has been done like really well. The lighting has definitely improved. The control, like sort of the whole general feeling of it, like little things have been improved in this game. Like for example, you can toggle crouch. Now in a game where stealth can play an element if you choose it to, having a toggle to crouch button is just it's amazing. I believe it was actually rather difficult to do this as a mod on the original game because of how the scripting works with some of the deeper elements of the engine. But having an engine rewrite has allowed all kinds of things. The water actually looks really nice. They've done a lot with the water in OpenMW. But of course, I will link to the press release on the OpenMW website to let you folks read it for yourself. But also, check out some of the previous ones. Check out what they've done as well. But also, check out the multiplayer Morrowind as well. Me and my friend Drew sometimes play it, and it's just amazing because we are like diehard Morrowind fans for decades now, and it is absolutely amazing to enjoy that game like as a multiplayer game. It's janky as the dickens. Like it you couldn't ever like sell it as an actual proper multiplayer game because it is clearly just botched together by community members who just love the game, who just want to play it. You know, it requires a degree of actual genuine RPG role-playing into it. And in fact, the best way to approach the multiplayer version of Morrowind is not to treat it as a game with the rules that the game set, but to treat it as a world in which to have a party of role, you know, like a role-playing game where you actually like play roles. You know, and one of you, you know, you could choose your characters, you could choose your classes, and sort of you sort of have to like make up your own story. But you've got the world, the characters, the combat system there for it. Fantastic. I can't tell you how how much fun that me and Drew have enjoyed it. But yeah, OpenMW rather is a fantastic game. Okay. So I think now is probably, if I'm not mistaken, a good time for the second ad read of the podcast. Oh, isn't this exciting? Right, let's get the ad read up. I think many of you diehard Destination Linux Network fans will already know what's about to come because they are good friends. The next sponsor is good friends of the Destination Linux Network. It is, of course, DigitalOcean. Who doesn't love DigitalOcean? DigitalOcean's great. Okay, so this episode of GameSphere... I'll start that one again. This episode of GameSphere is brought to you by DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean recently announced their new app platform service, which is a solution to build modern cloud-native apps. With the app platform, you can build, deploy, and scale apps and static websites quickly and easily. Simply point to your GitHub repository and let the app platform do all the heavy lifting. It has support for Node.js, Python, Go, PHP, Ruby, static sites, and Docker. I love me some static sites myself. That's what my website does. It's very simple. Got to keep it simple. Simple is the best, in my opinion. But you know, you can build as we say in Morrowind, like a Tulveni tower of stuff. If you want to do on DigitalOcean can handle it. It's great. Anyway, DigitalOcean runs their app platform on their own infrastructure, so your costs are significantly lower than with other products. Plus, they build this new app platform on top of DigitalOcean Kubernetes, providing a smoother migration path so you can take more control of your infrastructure setup. As a listener of the Destination Linux podcast and a member of the DLN community, you can get started for free. Better than free because DigitalOcean is giving you $100 of credit when you do do.co/DLN. Link, of course, will be in the show notes. do.co/DLN to get started with your $100 free credit on DigitalOcean's new app platform. But yeah, thank you, DigitalOcean. You've always been a good friend to the Destination Linux Network. And thank you once again. Destination Linux, of course, just a bit of a personal thought here, is the servers that we use to run, you know, the Game Fest stuff on. They're really good. They're reliable. They've never had any problem as far as I can see. I remember playing Mind Test on a DigitalOcean droplet, and it worked fantastically well. So yeah, like if that's, to me, like, you know, if you want to make the best use of DigitalOcean within the context of video games, they're great for, like, we had a Xonotic server, we had Super Tuxkart multiplayer. Get yourself a DigitalOcean droplet, run a Super Tuxkart server on that. Get like as many mates as you can. Friggin' amazing! It's something else. It's just, in fact, you know what? Go and check out that Destination Linux Game Fest live stream. You'll find the Super Tuxkart video section on there. That's amazing. I can't tell you how much fun I had on that, and there's a Xonotic game as well. But yeah, like it's really good for that kind of stuff because you can just spin up a server. You don't even have to keep it running. You can just put it in the freezer. And not literally, of course, but yeah, you can, and just spin it up when you and your chums want to have a bit of a shoot around, and it's great. Yeah, so you can do a lot with DigitalOcean, and they've always been kind to the Destination Linux Network, and thank you for making this show possible. So There we go. All right, let's check the old notes. And what have we got today? Oh, a game. We haven't. Yeah, let's talk about a game. Okay, open source game. Right. So I'm going to try and include an open source game. There's been a few open source games already, but I'm going to try and include like a review of an open source game in every episode if I can, because there are a lot of open source games out there, and many of them are phenomenal. Sometimes open source games, they are like they're kind of different to proprietary games in a number of ways, but in terms of their spirit, in terms of like why they're there, is to me makes a very meaningful difference. Like so many games that you'll buy, not all, but many games you'll buy, their entire purpose for existence is to make money for their studios, for their developers. They're to make sales, right? Most games are made within the purview of a business model, and that's fine. I mean, we've got some wonderful AAA games out there, some wonderful, and not quite AAA games, but like also quite big games. I'm a big fan of the Hitman franchise. Been having a lot of fun with Deus Ex as well. So there's a lot of good games out there. But if you want a humbler experience where a community can come together and develop something for themselves, that it doesn't matter if it makes a profit. It doesn't necessarily matter if it appeals to millions upon millions of people. That just a community come together and they just make something that they want to play and just enjoy it. I think there's something truly wholesome in that. I think there's something truly valuable in that. And I think there's something more meaningful in that than there is from like Warner Brothers making a shed load of cash from selling a game. That's just my thoughts on it. But today's game actually is not necessarily a community built game, but rather one built by I believe a sole developer. It's called Shapez. Now you can try out the game for free through the browser by going to shapez.io. Now that's SHAPEZ.io. So it's it's pronounced the same. It's recently had a big update where they actually bring in some new game mechanics post level 11, and it'll take you a while to get up to a level 11. But essentially, what Shapez is it's like a factory sim, and they say themselves that it is developed like it is inspired by the likes of Factorio. So if you like Factorio, you will probably like Shapez. You are designing a factory, and each level means that you have to make a different type of shape. So like level 1 might be that you just have to make a circle. Level 2 might be that you have to make a blue circle. And then level 3 might be you have to make a blue circle and then splice it with a red square. And then these shapes get more and more complicated as you go along. But the learning curve is very smooth, very easy, just wonderfully, the gradient of difficulty ramps up very, very slightly. You always know what you've got to do. And it's one of those games where it's quite chill. So there isn't really a failure state. You just have to, you just have to keep moving. Basically, you can take as long as you want to solve any of the given levels. You can do them in any number of ways that you desire. Like you can approach them differently. You can design your factory with different priorities, different structures, different layouts. And that's what I really love about games. That's, to me, what makes a good game, is that there isn't just one way of solving a problem, but you actually get to express some creativity in how problems are solved. That, to me, is that to me adds a lot of depth to a game. So how you build your factory, what you optimize, how you optimize it. You can use various, you store this shape over here until you need it over here, and all this kind of stuff. It's truly wonderful. Another thing about this game that I absolutely wonderfully love is the soundtrack. Now, the soundtrack itself is available on Bandcamp, which is absolutely amazing. And I did buy the soundtrack on Bandcamp as well. Bandcamp is amazing for music, in my humble opinion. But yeah, it's great game music. It suits the game so much. And the aesthetics of it, I really like the aesthetics of it. Now, it's a very basic, the graphics in it are very basic, but they're also very clear. Very clear, so that you always know what's going on. Although, admittedly, if you're anything like me, your factories are going to get a little bit sprawling, a little bit out of control. And the real challenge of the game is to keep this ever-expanding, ever-growing factory line consistent and logical, and how it makes sense, because you can so easily get lost in a machine of your own design. That's amazing. That is absolutely amazing. I can't sing this praises enough. I've mentioned this game in the amongst the various social medias that I'm on, and I know that other people have picked it up on my recommendation, and as a result, they have got really into this game as well. It's a great game. I think I'm no expert on the on the subject, but I think this game can be quite good for younger people as well. Like, it's certainly a family friendly game in that regard, but it's really good at it's good mental exercise there as well. And I think that could be in many ways sort of quite worthwhile. It certainly gives my brain quite the workout, which I really like. It looks good. The thing is as well, it's satisfying when you put together like a really efficient factory machine, and you're just seeing it do all the stuff, and it's not getting clogged up and all that kind of stuff. Like, that's really rewarding. I can't, that is excellent. Chef's kiss. So for the final segment of this week's Game Sphere, I want to do a segment which Michael has named, because partly the reason I'm slotting this in here is because of the name, but also because I quite like older games. To me, there's a golden age of video games that ranges from the late 90s to around 2010, and I still think that a lot of games from that genre work very well. Sometimes they're buggy and have since been patched to make them less buggy, but sometimes the game design in and of themselves, I feel, is in that nice sweet spot between not being overly complicated or complex or novel, while at the same time sort of being more complex and novel than the games preceding it. So you've got that sort of golden age of gaming there, and I think a lot of that is probably, if I'm completely honest, rooted in nostalgia. But this week's episode of Game Sphere, the segment, what I'm doing, is called Polygon But Not Forgotten. And for this segment, I'd like to talk about Hitman Codename 47. Hitman Codename 47 is a wonderful, really old game where you play as an assassin. It was released in 2000. It was very much the first game of its type, where you would be placed inside a level, you would have a target to kill, or targets, and you would have, in most cases, several ways that you could approach it. You could approach it in a gun-ho fashion, go in there, guns blazing, take out everyone. You could go in as a sniper. You could don a disguise and then sort of sneak in, pretending to be a guard or something. And whilst on replaying of the game recently, it definitely does show its age, and it shows its age mostly in the control system, right? And just to give you a bit of an example, you will have to reset the controls, right? I think the default controls have the numpad as the way to control that. I mean, that's a bit mad at the best of times. There is a WSAND style preset, but you're gonna wanna configure some things for modern sensibilities. But just to give you an example of how bad the controls really are, you can have W as run, and S as walk, and X as go backwards, A and D either strafing or turning left and right. I think the default is A and D turn left and right. Oh boy. Like I say, with defaults like that, you're gonna wanna have to adapt them to more modern sensibilities, absolutely. But once you've got through that headache, this game actually really does retain its charm. Now, there's a level based in Istanbul called Traditions of the Trade. That's the last good level of this game, right? Beyond that game, it does fall apart because it kind of feels like what a lot of games suffered from during the time, where they had a very ambitious idea for a game, they made it, and they got up to a certain point, and then they had to rush development of the final stages of the game to get out on a deadline. You see this happen. I mean, the worst example is Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. I won't go too much into that because that game has a fascinating history that I will talk about, no doubt, in another video, involving, of course, the introduction of the Source engine to the world and the madness that goes around that. But yes, it's it could very well have been the case that there was a deadline set, they're approaching the deadline, and the game falls back to a lot more tropes of the day. It became a lot more, shall we say, violent centric, a lot more like kill a room full of people, rather than previous levels where it was like, he's the bad guy, there's one guy over there, he's the gang leader and the bad man. You got to go in, you got to infiltrate, sneak past people, talk to people, get people on your side, and like be a bit of a spy. It does kind of have a little bit of a James Bond feel to it. And there are many points within the Hitman franchise where 47 sort of emulates a little bit of James Bond. If you are interested in the franchise, I recommend playing the newer games first. And in fact, the recent franchise of Hitman is, they call it the World of Assassination, which is the 3 recent games, the Hitman, Hitman 2, and then the one that's about to come out early next year. They're available on Stadia. You can play them on NVIDIA's GeForce Now, so you don't necessarily need a fast computer to run it if your internet connection's all right. But also, like, you can just buy them on Steam. I think they're available in the Epic Store. There is a limit. What do you call it? A timed exclusive. That's the term for the newest game in the franchise, because the Epic Store basically, they're getting the game a year ahead of Steam. But like I say, you can play it on. I think you can get it on Stadia on release day, because technically Stadia counts as a console, not a PC. But that aside, but going back and watching, not watching this, going back and playing this. And I only played up to Traditions of the Trade. Like, to me, this game, in terms of memory, in terms of nostalgia, it goes up to that final. To me, Traditions of the Trade is the final level of Hitman Codename 47. Keeps it as a nice short game. You could probably play it in an afternoon. If you know the game. Like, if you don't know the game, if you're new to the game, you're discovering it, working out the layouts of the level, working out what you're allowed to do, what you can get away with. That takes a lot of time. I remember spending days upon days upon days of working out certain levels in my youth, but now I can polish it off in an afternoon. Also, I think on the later stages of the game, the levels get quite big. I mean, they do. So there is a level in Colombia, which is, again, like, some of the levels are just big for the sake of being big, and there's not much inside them. That happens with a couple of the earlier Hitman games, but to be honest, you can get over that. Some of the games are actually quite compacted, and as a result, are quite fun in that regard. So yeah, with the earlier Hitman games, the quality of your gaming experience is going to be quite contingent on which level that in particular that you're playing. There are a lot of things wrong with Codename 47. Sometimes the controls, it can be quite buggy, but this is an example of a game which plays better on Linux than it does on Windows. And with the earlier Hitman games, and with a lot of games in this golden age of gaming, I find play much better being played through like Proton or Wine than they do on Windows. Apparently, the second game in the Hitman franchise, you need to do all kinds of backwards somersaults and whatever to get it running through, getting running on Windows. So I play it on Linux. In many ways, Linux in this particular instance is my preference for gaming, because it plays the games that I want to play better than any other operating system. Now, that's obviously not the typical case for, like that's my case is obviously an exception to the norm, but there are several instances where Linux does actually operate better as a gaming platform than Windows, which is it hasn't always. The gaming technology on Linux has definitely jumped leaps and bounds since in the past few years. But yeah, so going back to Codename 47, the plot makes no sense whatsoever, and I think like this is the reason the 2 Hitman films have failed colossally, terribly. They failed miserably. It's because like 47 is a little bit, the main character, the assassin as it were, is a little bit like Gordon Freeman insofar that he's not really designed to be an interesting, or he's not like an interesting character. I don't think he's supposed to be an interesting character. What's interesting about the games is the world in which he operates, all these interesting people that he's going to assassinate, and what they're trying to do, and why they why they're a danger to the world, or why they're a danger to the person hiring 47, and all of this, like all of the politics and scheming of the of these shadowy figures. That's what makes the world of Hitman interesting. And especially with the films, where you're learning more and more about 40. The more you learn about 47, the less it, like the worse it gets, because he's supposed to be a little bit like that blank slate Gordon Freeman kind of character. He's just a one-note song. He's an assassin. He's a cold-blooded killer. Doesn't care whatever reason. He kills like it's a job. Like some people, they're just working to check out at Walmart. Beep, beep, beep. 47's like he did the same thing. He might get paid a bit more, but to him, this is just a job. This is just another day in his life. And yeah, there is plot points behind it. There's plot in this game that sort of talks a little bit to his origin, but in the future games, his backstory matters less and less and less. And as a result, 47, 47 is not an interesting character. He's not an interesting person. And the game is at its strongest when it focuses on other people. And they do, and particularly in the traditions of this trade in Istanbul, there is a wonderful example of telling a story through the level design itself, right? So basically, you're 47. You have to kill 2 targets who are terrorists, and you have to retrieve a chemical bomb. Now, the reason for this is that there is a summit of world leaders being held in that hotel in the near future to when the level is set, and you have to stop that terrorist attack from happening. Now, you have no interest in the terrorist attack or anything to do, or any of the politics involved in that. You're doing a job for someone else. Someone else wants to stop that terrorist attack. So you're not the good guy in this equation. You're just the guy that shows up. You're the henchman. And you can see through the little set pieces, like all the way how they arrange all the flags and arrange the tables, and how parts of the hotel are cordoned off because for security reasons, and why there's metal detectors around and all this kind of stuff in a hotel. And it tells this story of what's about to happen through the level design itself, without actually giving too much away. It's the classic show don't tell phenomena. And it does this in many cases really, really well, especially throughout the franchise. But this is as an introduction to the franchise. Many people consider it the worst game. I think I probably do consider it the worst game of the franchise. But it still has that charm. It still has that, and part of it's nostalgia, and part of it's just like, this is an example. This is a snapshot in time of how games were developed and how games were seen and how games were a media or a medium to experiment and to try new things. And to be honest, nowadays with a lot of modern games, sometimes you get that in the indie scene, but in a lot of cases you do just get reiterations of existing ideas. And I suppose in many ways, I do feel that games during this era, in between the late 90s and 2010, that they were a bit more adventurous. Nowadays, I feel that sort of ideas just sort of come slowly, and there's a little change here, and then it gets developed, and then it gets developed, then it gets developed. Whereas I think back in the mid 2000s, for example, there were all kinds of interesting stuff, or interesting things being tried, and I think they were by and large received quite well. But the more and more mainstream gaming becomes, the more and more money gets thrown into it, the more and more it's going to become like the movie industry. And as I'm sure many folks will agree with me, modern like movies today, especially ones funded by the big studios, they're pretty unadventurous. They're pretty like formulaic. Most seem to be sequels nowadays, and in a lot of cases that's simply down to the fact that the money has sort of taken over a little bit, and the big studios have taken over with playing, making very safe choices. And I mean, it's not all bad, but in many ways, it does feel that games of this era just were a little bit, they were a little bit more adventurous, and sometimes that did mean falling flat on your face in certain circumstances, and sometimes it didn't. But anyway, I think that's all I've got to say on Codename 47. Would I recommend you folks at home try it out? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, maybe not. I don't know. If you feel like it's maybe I don't know. It's not going to be the smoothest, cleanest, nicest experience you'll ever have with gaming, but it is it's interesting. I don't know. I consider it a little bit of gaming history, quite frankly. But anyway, so I think this is a good opportunity to wrap up the very first episode of GameSphere. How about that? That's quite. So thank you, folks, for joining me. Now there is a segment that I want to include in future episodes, which for obvious reasons I can't today, and that's a feedback episode. So included in the show notes for this episode will be an email address, and I'll put some social media links as well. If you want to go to my personal website, chriswere.uk, you can find out where, all the social medias that I am, and also there is I think it's gamesphere.show. Oh crikey, yes, gamesphere.show. That's where all the episodes and stuff. I remembered that. I didn't just really quickly type it at my computer. But yeah, you can go to gamesphere.show. There'll be all the episodes there. There'll be all the notes and all that kind of stuff. There'll be the RSS feed. This can be found on, I believe, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and Spotify. But yeah, and write in, share your thoughts, share any recommendations you have. I certainly don't want this to be the kind of podcast where I just bawl opinions at you for 40 minutes. I this is a dialogue, and I'm always open to having my mind changed on issues around gaming, because, I'm but one person, and this is a very subjective medium. So, yes, please do feel free to let me know all of your hot and spicy takes. And then I'll do a segment. Yeah, I'll do like a listener feedback segment, which I'm sure you folks would quite enjoy. So, but yeah, check out gamesphere.show. There'll be all the bits and pieces and stuff and show notes and stuff and things and stuff on there. But I think this is time to leave you now. For those of you that know, who watch my live streams, and those that even watch my videos across on YouTube, will know that it takes me a while to wrap up a video. I ramble on and witter on about how nice it is that you folks have joined me. So I'm going to try and wrap it up really quickly, but I've got that feeling at the back of my mind. There's something that I want to say that I should be saying. But check out the Destination Linux. And I want to thank particularly Michael and Ryan for making me feel for giving me such a warm welcome. And the rest of the Destination Linux network as well, who joined me on or who I joined rather, on the Destination Linux Game Fest. It was an absolute blast. So, like I said, I'll put the link to the live stream on the Destination Linux Network channel. You can probably look it up yourself, of course, on YouTube if you're so inclined as well. And yeah, we had a lot of fun. But yeah, thank you everyone at the network for making me feel so welcome, and for all of your guidance and help and stuff. And thank you all for listening. So that's about it from me today. I haven't worked out an outro for this, because I just use my I've been chriswere and you've been awesome. For those of you that know me, that's my usual outro. I'll have to work this one out. It'd be like, thank you for joining me. I've been chriswere, and you've been listening to the Gamesphere. This is the Gamesphere. The Gamesphere. The Gamesphere. Gamesphere. Goodbye. All right, now I'm just saying Gamesphere, so I'll take my leave. But thank you, folks, very much for joining me. It's a pleasure as always. And until next time, I've been chriswere, and you've been listening to the Gamesphere. Toodaloo.